Thanks for coming out. Have any folks here been to any of my previous talks? Oh, you have, okay. So I apologize if I repeat some of what I've talked about, but there's been such an outbreak of anti-Semitism, new anti-Semitic incidents and new topics to talk about. So a lot of what I'm going to cover is actually new. But I do want to go into some of the sociology of anti-Semitism in Europe, which you may have heard in one of my talks. I'm going to cover what's unfolded in terms of Europe. I'll probably concentrate mainly on Germany and Austria, but I will expand into other countries on the continent. The UK, I'm not going to deal with as much, probably just touch on it. So that's going to, I'm going to cover, as I mentioned, the sociology, one form of anti-Semitism that I don't think has been addressed. It's called guilt defensiveness anti-Semitism. Then I'm going to delve into Germany's, how Germany's dealing with anti-Semitism, and Iran, and anti-Semitism in the academy, some of the countervailing forces against BDS and anti-Semitism. There have been some, I know this will shock this audience, but there have actually been some efforts that have succeeded in countering anti-Semitism on college campuses in Europe, including anti-BDS resolutions. And then I will, we can open up to questions about what I've discussed. I will also focus on how anti-Semitism, the interplay between eliminatory anti-Semitism or lethal anti-Semitism and terrorism, whether it's Islamic animated terrorism, for example, Hezbollah, which is present in Europe, or secular Palestinian terrorism like the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. So let me start just with an article in the New York Post, ex-NYPD police chief on how to fight surge and anti-Semitic crimes, written by Raymond Kelly and two other intelligence officials with the New York City Police Department. Kelly, of course, I assume everyone knows, was the former chief of police, very distinguished police officer and counterterrorism expert. What have we learned? They did a tour of Europe, so I think this was relevant. Extreme left-wing progressive anti-Zionism that at a practical level often bleeds into anti-Semitism see the UK's potential next Prime Minister, Jeremy Corbyn. And then he lists far-right anti-Semitism, neo-Nazism, the rise of the AfD, and then further down they talk about anti-Semitism from Muslim communities. So, you know, in an abbreviated version for a New York City daily, they tried to cover what their experiences were in Europe and what they learned and these types of anti-Semitism. My objection to this analysis is extreme left-wing progressive anti-Semitism that as a practical level often bleeds into anti-Semitism. So the premise here is that one can make the distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, which shows, unfortunately, there's not a common definition, I should say, in terms of what constitutes anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism, from my perspective, is now identical with anti-Semitism. Professor Robert Wistrich, who is the head of the Vidal Sassoon Center of Anti-Semitism Studies at the Hebrew University, he died recently and is widely considered the leading scholar on anti-Semitism, argued that after World War II, after the Shoah, anti-Zionism can only be understood as anti-Semitism. That one could make the argument prior to the establishment of the State of Israel that anti-Zionism was not anti-Semitism, but given that the end result of anti-Zionism is the obliteration of the Jewish state and over 6 million Jews, it's hard not to interpret or read into anti-Zionism as anything other than an anti-Semitic contention. So that's my objection to this sort of reading of what's happening in Europe. What they didn't comment on, and I think this is a problem not only in the United States in terms of trying to understand European anti-Semitism, but also in Europe. And this theory goes back to Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, two German Marxist philosophers, sort of master thinkers because of their contribution to philosophy, both before the show and after. They were actually worked for this organization, not ISGAP, but for the American Jewish Committee, which I believe owns this building or is lodged here, in the 1940s, and did some research work for the American Jewish Committee. After they fled Nazi-occupied Europe, they lived in the United States, and then both men returned to Germany. And they developed this theory mainly as sort of a sociological theory of guilt defensiveness anti-Semitism. That again, I'm engaging in sweeping generalizations here, so put scary quotes on a lot of things I'm saying because we don't have a lot of time. But that basically means that how Germans responded to the Holocaust after 1945. This notion that the response to the Holocaust produced anti-Semitism. In short, that Germans were filled with a sense of, again, I'm generalizing here, but many Germans, large swaths of the population, were filled with a sense of pathological guilt about the crimes of the Holocaust. I'm not talking just about the perpetrators, I'm talking about future generations. It could even be the children of the perpetrators, the grandchildren, but this notion that one is filled with guilt about the crimes of the National Socialists, whether their parents were involved or grandparents or great-grandparents, given the generational shift, produce this sense of guilt. And how does one purge guilt? The theory is to blame Jews, and that's why Adorno and Horkheimer, writing in the late 40s and then continuing with their writings into the 60s, described the German reaction as a way to blame Jews. Now, as human history moved forward, blaming Jews after the Holocaust was not politically and socially correct. So what's happened is a shift where Israel has now become a substitute for the Jew, and as a famous French historian said, Israel is now the Jew among the nations, which I'm sure many of you heard this famous quote from a French Jewish historian. And that's presented a whole new anti-Semitic dynamic and really force a sort of a tsunami wave of anti-Semitism, because you have, and I would argue this type of guilt defensiveness anti-Semitism applies mainly to Western Europe. I haven't seen it as ubiquitous in Eastern Europe, but my experiences in Europe, in France, in Italy, the Scandinavian countries like Norway and that were complicit with the National Socialists, et cetera, there's this sense now, well, we can't single out individual Jews, but we will turn Israel into a human punching bag in order to purge our guilt about the crimes of the Hitler movement. Now, this may sound like a lot of sort of kitchen sink psychology, but I haven't found a more compelling or plausible explanation for why Europe is intensely preoccupied with Israel. As we saw recently, there were scores of resolutions at the UN castigating Israel. Germany, Austria, all of Western Europe again joined countries like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Iran, in passing resolutions against Israel. Israel is the most sanctioned country at the UN. It's well above any of these countries that commit real atrocities. And then, of course, the European media, if you immerse yourself in it, resolutions in European parliaments, nation-state parliaments, but also the European Parliament are largely obsessed with Israel. I would argue pathologically obsessed at times. And the question then is, how do you explain this intense preoccupation with Israel, the Jewish state? Why is there, we just saw the recent example, I'm sure folks have followed it with Airbnb, right? And how does one explain the Airbnb example as opposed to Airbnb in other areas of the world where there are territorial disputes that Airbnb has not taken action against? There's a word for it, starts with an A, anti-Semitism, and it's based on disparate treatment or discrimination. That's sort of, when you strip anti-Semitism down to its core meaning, as the late Charles Krauthammer, the distinguished columnist for the Washington Post, once wrote, that anti-Semitism is just discrimination against Jews. I would argue that, within the European context, but also in the American context, one of the core components of anti-Semitism is the eliminatory quality. That means in contrast to other forms of discrimination, whether it's sexism, racism, homophobia, anti-Semitism at its core involves a lethal streak that wants to dissolve Jews. And we saw that happen in Pittsburgh. And that's why anti-Semitism is so distinct. It separates itself from these other forms of discrimination. And I don't think the efforts to conflate anti-Semitism with racism and all these other isms is justified, as we commonly see, I think, in this country, because of the extreme nature of identity politics and multiculturalism that's gone to its extreme. I'm not against multiculturalism or identity politics, but I do think it's a dangerous situation when anti-Semitism, given what's happened in Europe, in light of what's happened in Pittsburgh, somehow loses its meaning and the destructive streak associated with it and where it can lead. So again, I can't overemphasize enough the eliminatory quality of anti-Semitism and how that differentiates from the other forms of discrimination. So my theory now is not really a theory, it's just adding another layer, I suppose, to what Adorno and Horkheimer said, is the idea that Germans and others are responding to the Holocaust by bashing Israel as a way of, cleansing themselves of their guilt is a form of anti-Semitism. I would now argue that what you have is a new version of what Zivi Rex, a famous Israeli psychoanalyst, called, the psychoanalysts in the 80s basically summed up Adorno and Horkheimer, because when you try to read them, it's largely unintelligible at times because their philosophy is so dense. And I know very few people who really understand it. If you can garner some of the meaning, it's a success. But Zivi Rex, this Israeli psychoanalyst, said, the Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz. Right? He meant that with sarcasm and biting humor. What I think is unfolding right now is the Western Europeans largely will never forgive the Israelis for the Holocaust. I don't know of any other plausible or compelling explanation out there that provides evidence as to why there's such an intense infatuation with Israel and examining every single move that's taking place in the state of Israel as opposed to other countries. And again, it's mainly coming from the EU. One example I think that perhaps adds fuel to the fire, the anti-Semitic fire, in terms of why Israel's preoccupied with, why Europe is preoccupied with Israel, is the recent demarcation of Israeli products from the disputed territories of Judea and Samaria and the Golan Heights and East Jerusalem. In 2015, the EU passed a resolution to label Israeli products, right? Which is, in my view, another version, a modernized version of "Don't Buy from Jews" from the, right. They won't call it BDS, but they put a label on Israeli products, similar to what Airbnb just did, but this label only applied to one territorial dispute, Israel. The EU was very zealous about passing that. The German Green Party, I should note, passed a similar resolution in 2013 in the Bundestag. And the German Green Party is a very powerful party in Germany. They're gaining votes. They have a coalition government in the southwestern state of Baden-Württemberg with Merkel's party. So the Greens and the conservative Christian Democratic Union have formed coalition. Germany has 16 states, and a number of the states, or at least in this state, we see a coalition. And they may very well be in the next government. The German Greens in 2013 passed an initiative in the Bundestag calling for, or urging a labeling of Israeli products. When I did some homework on this topic, I found that the neo-Nazi party in Germany, the MPD, it's a small neo-Nazi party that's maybe in some state parliaments now, but it's not insignificant, but it's not a major threat to Germany's democracy. The MPD in a state parliament in eastern Germany passed a resolution a year before the Greens that called for the punitive measures against Israeli products, labeling system. It was based, and the Greens adopted this resolution. It was almost the same language, and I called up the Green Party and I wrote them and I said, how do you explain this? Did you guys, did you folks sort of steal the neo-Nazi language and use it for their own? And the Green Party spokesman got all bent out of shape, and how dare you say that, and et cetera, et cetera. And I queried him over and over. Have you initiated any other resolutions to penalize any other countries involved in territorial disputes? No, et cetera, et cetera. Is that anti-Semitism? No, of course not. Of course not. So, these are the types of conversations you have with many Europeans on this matter. This week I reported that in the Jerusalem Post, I got a nice exclusive. I'm showing off a bit, but it happens every once in a while, and it's worth noting. A Western source told me that Chancellor Merkel worked overtime to convince the Romania's president not to relocate its embassy to Jerusalem. And I was told that by this source, it's believed that Merkel also campaigned in Europe to convince other European politicians. So this is interesting because if you go back 10 years, when Merkel delivered her famous Knesset speech in Israel, she declared Israel's security to be non-negotiable, right? These are the words she used, and that Israel's security is part of the national interests of Germany. So that sets a very high standard in terms of recognizing the security of interest and going to great lengths to protect it. But at the same time, Israel's priority is to declare that decide which city is its capital, as every country can decide, and Germany is working overtime to prevent that. It's unsettling because this idea of not allowing Israel to decide what its capital is or where it's located plays into the delegitimacy of Israel and strips Israel of its authenticity and its existence. So it gets into the whole BDS stuff when you start talking about delegitimization, which I considered actually to be the most deadly part of BDS in many ways. The economic damage to Israel has been limited and contained, but it still needs to be observed and countered. But the attacks on Israel's authenticity as a Jewish state, on its sheer existence, and the efforts to strip Israel of its identity and dismantle its existence through this delegitimization, through the efforts by Merkel, for example, to block countries from moving their embassies to Jerusalem, that's a serious problem. Just by way of background, when I contacted the Romanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they declined to comment. They punted me over to the president. The president declined to comment. The Germans declined to comment. They said, we're working for a two-state solution. They did not deny the report, and the Israelis did not deny the report. They declined to comment, or the embassy in Berlin. At the same time that this happened, as I mentioned, Germany was working overtime with its European counterparts to join the jackals at the UN and sanction Israel with this series of resolutions. Austria's Sebastian Kurz, many of you may know, this relatively new chancellor, very young, has declared, similar to Merkel, that Austria's national security interests encompass Israel's national security interests. And to his credit, he's made progress, but he joined the jackals too at the UN. So it's somewhat inexplicable. Both countries also, Austria and Germany, that have declared Israel's security interests to be identical with their security interests, refused to join U.S. sanctions against Iran. This leads me into Iran, which, as folks know, is according to the U.S. State Department, the top state sponsor, or top international sponsor, state sponsor of terrorism, but also lethal anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. So that's the Iranian regime. Germany's has a very ugly romance with Iran. I'll just put up an article I wrote here in Tablet. I delve into why Germany seeks to increase trade with a murderous theocracy bent on Israel's destruction. This is sort of the topic that dare not speak its name in Germany, this refusal by Germany to join U.S. sanctions against Iran. Now, just to lay out the, I guess, the disconnects, as I would call them. On the one hand, we have this, what Merkel's speech in the Knesset. On the other hand, we have Merkel showing up as part of a joint cabinet meeting in a consultation meeting in October in Israel. The German cabinet and the Israeli cabinet met. They have these annual consultation meetings. Merkel reportedly skipped the last one or called it off because she was upset with the settlement policies. At this meeting, President Reuven Rivlin, urged Merkel to join U.S. sanctions against Iran. She rebuffed him. Her foreign minister, Heiko Maas, is a social democrat. The current German government is made up of the conservatives, a Bavarian Conservative Party, Merkel's party, the Christian Democratic Union, and the Social Democrats, who are dropping in the polls everywhere. Her foreign minister, Heiko Maas, declared earlier this year, when he was appointed the new foreign minister, that he went into politics because of Auschwitz. That's his language. He went into politics because of Auschwitz. Meanwhile, Heiko Maas is working like Merkel overtime to bust the U.S. sanctions against Iran, the top state sponsor of lethal anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. The U.S. government is trying to stop the Europeans from evading their sanctions since they went into effect on November 5th, 6th. And there's a special purpose vehicle that the Europeans want to create that will allow the Iranians and the Europeans to trade. They want to bypass the sanctions, the Europeans, and insulate European companies against American sanctions. So Maas is working to set up this a new system. He went as far as to try to bypass SWIFT. Do folks know what SWIFT is? This international banking system in Brussels that allows for cross-national payments. For example, if you want to transfer funds to Israel, you need that SWIFT code, and you can transfer funds. That's very important for Iranian banks. If you can disconnect all the Iranian financial institutions, as the Europeans and the Americans did last term, or back in 2012, you can, that many consider helped bring the Iranians to the negotiating table. And the Americans have helped right now under the Treasury Secretary. He's convinced some of the Brussels headquarters of SWIFT to disconnect, for example, the Central Bank of Iran. Very important because, again, all of this, how does this lead into, to get back to anti-Semitism? All this funding, right? It allows Iran to fund its export of anti-Semitism when they have this type of money. So if you can dry up the funding streams, it helps curtail some of the anti-Semitism that Iran exports to around the world, or via attacks. For example, folks have probably read in the media recently, Iranian intelligence agencies plotted to assassinate Iranian dissidents in Paris, where former Mayor Rudolph Giuliani spoke, and others. Bolton, the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, has spoke at this event in the past. And in Denmark, there was another plot recently where Iranians were caught. And of course, Burgas in 2012, where Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy that receives $700 to $1 billion a year in funding from Iran, the Lebanese Shiite militia, blew up an Israeli tour bus, killed 5 Israelis in Burgas, Bulgaria, a seaside resort, and murdered their Bulgarian Muslim bus driver. 32 additional Israelis were injured. It's a clear-cut case not only of terrorism, but lethal anti-Semitism. So that's the type of funding that the Europeans are continuing to boost, instead of boost in the sense of they don't want to curtail the funding. They're actually trying to dismantle U.S. sanctions, and it's all very unsettling from the perspective of folks who want to combat anti-Semitism and terrorism. Okay, let me show the videos. I'm going to sit and speak up. If that works, tell me if I'm not speaking loud enough. Let me know. Okay, the first video is, I'm going back to the embassy discussion. I should have showed this video at that point. This is what took place in Berlin when the Trump administration announced it was going to move its embassy to Jerusalem. This is for the Brandenburger Tor. 1,000 people were at this rally in front of the American embassy. During the rally, they burned Israeli Stars of David and the American flag. Showed flags of Fatah and other Islamic organizations. Death to Israel, child murderer Israel. Those were the slogans that were used. Berlin police then ended the assembly and arrested one participant. See the Turkish flags, which is very interesting. Yeah. So what's interesting, I thought, about that video, I mean, aside from these mass rallies that turn out large numbers of times Germans, but it looked like mainly German Muslims, is I haven't seen these types of rallies when it comes to the over 500,000 people that have been murdered by Assad, Putin, Hezbollah, and Iran in Syria. Or I haven't seen these types of rallies when, for example, mass gas attacks take place. So again, it's interesting to notice these disconnects and how to explain them. The other thing that was interesting, I thought, was the Turkish flags, because it shows that Erdogan has also whipped up a level of anti-Semitic mania in Germany since his election in, 2003, I believe he was elected. I've noticed that as someone who follows Turkish anti-Semitism and Turkish nationalism, that the increase, again, this is anecdotal, when I go to these rallies, I see increased numbers of German Turks and Turks there, and at these mass, really anti-Semitic rallies. That didn't take place before Erdogan was in power, I was told by Germans who lived in Germany and have observed anti-Israeli marches. Now I just want to show, let's see. So this was a BDS event in October. This event took place at a cinema in East Berlin involving a Holocaust film festival that was sponsored by the Israeli government. No culture in whitewashing apartheid. Interesting, the audience is booing them. These are the German audience.
BDS-Bullshit der Spitzenklasse.
Well, this is interesting. Let's see. Okay, there. Someone just swore at them in German. So we have an interesting response here. The audience is clapping that they were removed. So you can see that it's from the perspective of this being a nonviolent movement and not wanting to have nothing to do with anti-Semitism or playing down the Holocaust or watering it down. These episodes certainly show the contrary, because the trespassing incident allegedly involved some type of assault. There's an assault charge that played out. And what's interesting is the Berlin Intelligence Agency, which is roughly the equivalent of the FBI without the same police powers, issued an intelligence report this year that said the incident that took place at the Humboldt University last year was an expression of anti-Semitism. So they did, you have now in Germany this year, which is kind of remarkable when you think about it, because I don't think in the United States we have intelligence agencies or the State Department declaring BDS to be anti-Semitic. You have 3 agencies, state intelligence agencies in Germany that have written in their reports. It's in German. I translated the reports or the sections that are relevant to BDS and wrote about them for different publications, including in The Hill. So in some way, one can argue, and I made this argument with a colleague of mine from Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, you can make the comparison between Nazism and BDS. And that's where the Germans and German intelligence officials have done that. There are neo-Nazi parties in Germany that support BDS. I mentioned one, the MPD. There's another one called the Third Way, which is a sort of a left-wing Nazi party, small party that promotes a lot of BDS, and I've written about this neo-Nazi party's connection with Hezbollah and Assad. They've traveled to Lebanon and Syria over the years to meet with officials. So you have these sorts of linkages getting into the whole issue of counterterrorism, as I mentioned, and how to approach BDS. The Third Way, this neo-Nazi party, also uses PayPal to raise funds. I've written PayPal, over the last week, emails asking them, in light of Pittsburgh, do they plan to take any action against this account? Haven't heard back from them. Over the years, they've insisted they have some type of no-hate policy, but they have not closed this account of the Third Way, this neo-Nazi organization, which is inexplicable to me because, and it may have something to do with German law, but I find that also not believable because PayPal shut down this year 5 BDS accounts in France. Some of my work involves exposing BDS organizations that are engaged in illicit terror finance, working with, as I mentioned, the PFLP. But in France, you have a very powerful anti-BDS law, or what's been interpreted to be an anti-BDS law. There's a piece of anti-discrimination legislation that bars discrimination based on national origin. The French have enforced that law. So if you find a BDS organization in France that uses a French bank or PayPal, and you notify the bank or the online payment service, generally they shut down the accounts. So that's what's happened. In the United States, it'd probably be a protected free speech issue, but if you can show, obviously, terrorism issues, and that's what I've done with some accounts in Germany and Austria, where, for example, Laila Khaled has appeared and spoke at, I'm trying to think of the organization, it was an Austrian Muslim community organization in Vienna where she spoke a number of years ago. I found out they had an account with an Austrian bank, and because of the PFLP connection, she was, of course, involved with 2 hijackings in the late 60s, early 70s, and she's a convicted terrorist. She's for PFLP is a U.S. and EU designated terrorist organization. The Austrian bank, because they were mainly scared about the Americans again, and their access to the American market, that's what it usually comes down to in the end, closed the account. But there have been other cases of this where you can show the interplay between, in this case, the PFLP, which runs a big BDS operation, including in South Africa, and banks. Just a couple of quotes that I think are relevant that resonate with me over the years, and these quotes took place one has to think about it. One quote is from the late 60s from Jean Amri. He's a Holocaust survivor, originally from Vienna. He's not very well known in the U.S., unfortunately, journalist, but one of the most piercing writers on anti-Semitism, and also criticized Hannah Arendt for her theory about the banality of evil, and that she played down the whole banality of evil. He's a very complex figure, but the quote in this, and by the way, he's also a leftist, which is interesting, which folks also don't realize. But in the late 60s, he said, open quote, "Anti-Zionism contains anti-Semitism like a cloud contains rain," close quote. So again, this is going back over 50 years ago. So we're still discussing whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. He recognized it, as a survivor of Auschwitz, over 50 years ago, right after the Six-Day War, I suspect, when that new wave of anti-Semitism kicked in because the Israelis flexed their muscles and defeated the Arab world. Hans Meyer, also a leftist, a German Marxist literary theorist, who survived the Holocaust, I believe, in Switzerland. He said in his biography, and this was going back in the early 70s, wrote, open quote, "Whoever attacks Zionism, but by no means wishes to say anything against the Jews, is fooling himself and others. The state of Israel is a Jewish state. Whoever wants to destroy it, openly or through policies that can affect nothing else but such destruction, is practicing the Jew hatred of yesterday and time immemorial," close quote. Again, this quote's almost 50 years old. Just 2 other things here I just want to point out, again, in terms of the disconnect, because I forgot this. Ali Larijani, I just want to mention this as a footnote to my talk on the Iran section and the disconnect in Germany between these revolutionary phrases about fighting anti-Semitism. We must counter anti-Semitism. We stand with Israel, and we have to catch it at its origin, and never again. We hear this type of very flowery, passionate rhetoric. When Ali Larijani attended the Munich Security Conference in 2009, he, by the way, is the president of Iran's phony parliament. He denied the Holocaust. This was written about in Spiegel. I wrote about it in the Wall Street Journal. It was written about in a number of publications. There was no investigation into his Holocaust denial. There was no outrage, politicians calling for him to be arrested or prosecuted. A year before, in 2008, his brother, Mohammad Larijani, who's the head of Iran's sort of phony Human Rights Council. The Larijani family is a very big family in Iran, and they control many levers of power. Obviously, they're beholden to Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. But in 2008, near the Holocaust Memorial, at an event held at the German Foreign Ministry, Mohammad Larijani denied the Holocaust and called for Israel's destruction. Again, no investigation from the state prosecutor because of Holocaust denial. The Foreign Ministry did not blast him. Politicians were indifferent, and civil society was largely indifferent. I mean, I wrote an article in a German paper about it, Die Welt and other publications, but that was only because of because I was pushing and being somewhat of a public nuisance. But at the same time that these gentlemen were denying the Holocaust, if folks remember, Richard Williamson, who's a Catholic bishop, denied the Holocaust in Germany and was prosecuted, and he paid a fine. And Merkel was so outraged about his Holocaust denial that she urged the Pope at that time to condemn Williamson. But Merkel has never urged the supreme leader of Iran to condemn Holocaust denial. So these are the disconnects that play out. Or she didn't go on record condemning the Larijani brothers for not only calling for the destruction of Israel, but denying the Holocaust on German soil. Again, it's illegal in Germany to deny the Holocaust. So these are the questions that I've written about or tried to address in my piece in Tablet, tried to explain why. It's obviously it's a tough subject, but I think I will end there because, as I mentioned, good questions are better than good answers, and we can start the Q&A session. And thanks for listening. Yeah, well, it wasn't a question. It was a statement that her Merkel's immigration policy, where she let in over 1 million. I think it was over 1 million. That's immigrants, refugees, migrants from mainly Muslim-majority countries, belies her effort to combat anti-Semitism. What was the first part? The Obama gave Iran, or as part of the Iran nuclear deal, Obama's administration agreed to provide Iran with $150 billion, and Iran has enough finances. In terms of these are interesting questions about Merkel's decision to open the borders. No one really knows why in the end. I mean, there's been a lot of speculation. One idea is what you addressed, that this idea of wanting to show that one is completely out of the barbarism of the jungle, and has completely made good in terms of what's happened during the Shoah, and this is more evidence that we've rehabilitated ourselves. I would say that there's another form of anti-Semitism that I didn't address because I didn't have enough time, that dovetails into this. There's an author, his name is Wolfgang Port. Wolfgang Port said, in terms of anti-Semitism, that one problem with Germany right now is, and you may see this with the absorption of refugees and migrants and immigrants, this notion of wanting to be holier than thou, in the sense that we know better. And Wolfgang Port once described Germany's relationship to Israel is one in which Germany is now Israel's probation officer. And we want to ensure that you Israelis don't fall back into any sort of form of recidivism where you regress and that we need to somehow then punish you again. And it's a very weird dynamic because you have the whole German remembrance culture, memory culture, serving as a way to allow one to get on his or her high horse and let the Israelis know we've learned the lessons of 2 world wars. We can now tell you when you're transgressing, and we're going to serve as Port said as your probation officer. And what you went through to extend his idea during the Holocaust was sort of and I'm being a bit polemical here, but what you went through during the Holocaust was sort of a reform school and a form of cognitive behavioral therapy in the extermination and concentration camps. You should have learned your lessons too. And you see that form of anti-Semitism, not only in Germany, but you've seen that, I think, also in Britain, and in other countries where people will say, well, you Jews should have learned your lessons, from World War II, and why are you replicating the policies of, the Nazis? And that's when you get into that type of anti-Semitism. In terms of Obama and the 150 billion, I completely agree. I was vehemently opposed to the Iran deal. I've spent in addition to writing about anti-Semitism, because it's so ubiquitous in Europe and you can't ignore it, it really, as I said, it's the amount of anti-Semitism that I experienced since 2002 until the president just keeps mushrooming and mushrooming and mushrooming. And of course, then we've experienced the lethal anti-Semitic attacks in France and Belgium, in Germany too, of course, to Christmas 2016, I believe, when the Tunisian refugee or migrant drove a tractor trailer into the Christmas market in Berlin and killed, I believe, 10 people to 11, right, including an Israeli woman. Took Merkel almost a year to visit the families. They complained in a public letter that she was ignoring their request to meet. I wrote about this in the Jerusalem Post and showed, according to the families, showed zero empathy for what they went through, which was interesting. Next question. In terms of the occupation, I think it's important, you mentioned the occupation. I think it's important to stress that the occupation is not causing anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is causing anti-Semitism. Right. But it's important, I think, in that one have these types of arguments when discussing with your fellow Jews or non-Jews in terms of what causes anti-Semitism. And it's clearly not the settlement policies. It's clearly not the occupation. We know all this in terms of Israeli history, and you have to point that out. Look, it's a very exasperating and difficult conversation to have with many Jews and non-Jews who don't understand the Middle East, especially because you expect more from Jews. I understand that. I'm constantly in that situation in Europe. You almost have to have a bottomless level of patience, as I said at the outset of this talk, in terms of bringing these arguments, having these very patient discussions. You're not going to be able to convince a person in one discussion. But when you walk away from that person, and this has been my experience, there's a lot whirling around that person's head. In terms of the unity question, in the end, if you want to, in the United States, if you want to change policies, electoral politics is the name of the game, right? Wasn't it Obama who said elections have consequences? So Trump was elected, and he dismantled the Iran agreement. Whatever, putting aside the politics of Trump, that's what his constituency wanted. With elected politicians, again, it involves grassroots organizing. This is very hard work. As someone who used to work in the union movement in New York City, here I worked for a healthcare workers union, 1199 when I was young, and I know. But by the way, this is important because the American labor movement in 2006 was the first national labor movement to oppose BDS. I was in Germany at the time, and Stuart Applebaum from the Retail Wholesale Department Store Workers Union, who's a liberal, Jewish, gay Zionist, worked with me, and we got the German unions to issue an anti-BDS statement back in 2006. That was a year after BDS was declared. So you can do these things. I think that helped. Maybe I'm showing off too much, but I think that helped sort of counter the anti-Israelism in Germany a bit when you have the head of the major German union say, this is anti-Semitic. This reminds me of the 30s. But my point again is grassroots organizing in the end, and it's very grueling work because you have to sweat, you lose a lot of sleep, you're filled with stress, you're filled with painful amounts of anxiety, but that's the name of the game. All the other stuff is important, but it's just icing on the cake. The real work in terms of defeating BDS, and folks we see this now happening in the US because American Jews and other organizations, pro-Israel organizations, have recognized the danger, are doing more grassroots work on the campuses. Let me get to her question because I'm doing too much talking. I agree with you in terms of the semantics and how one defines what pro-Israel means. But I think in general, the 90+% of American Jewry who are pro-Israel, they don't want Israel to be dismantled. There may be disagreements, sharp disagreements over the disputed territories, but we're not talking about what I see in Europe, where you have significant numbers of people, large swaths of the population in Western Europe, who have very radical views about Israel's existence. That there's a 180-degree difference between what's taking place in Europe right now, Western Europe again, and I think that's where you see Israel making some very smart moves. I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu is, as folks have seen, he's very focused on India, China, these countries, Bahrain now, Bahrain and Oman, right? And I think that's a very, very clever and sophisticated foreign policy to his credit. And moving away from these Western European countries because of, as I said, because, again, to be polemical, because they won't forgive the Israelis for the Holocaust. We'll see whether there are new generations who will, because of education, who will break from this widespread anti-Israeli ideology. We've seen cases of that. I should note, at a number of German universities, Gutenberg, in Mainz, named after the famous printing press developer, the Goethe University in Frankfurt, named after the famous German poet, and in Leipzig, the student councils at these major universities, these are huge universities like the, University of Michigan, or when I watch these sporting events at times, or voted to condemn BDS as being anti-Semitic. So they passed resolutions. One university passed a resolution and prevailed, Heidelberg, Germany's oldest university this year, but then they lost because there was some irregularity with the secrecy of the ballots. It's supposed to be a closed ballot, but maybe there'll be another vote there. The University of Vienna 2 years ago also passed a resolution, the students condemning BDS as anti-Semitic. I should note at the University of Vienna, these were also socialist, communist, and Green Party students who voted to condemn BDS as anti-Semitic. There have been some very interesting developments among youth organizations in Germany from these political parties that view BDS as anti-Semitic. So you see, we don't know where these developments are tending, right? People can quickly reverse their views, as we saw in 1967 after Israel won the Six-Day War. A very pro-Israel student movement in Germany suddenly, within a rapid-fire period of time, became anti-Israel. So I'm tend to proceed with great caution and skepticism, but there are encouraging signs. And then we'll go back to you. And then wait, can we deal with his question and come back to you since he hasn't answered the question? Is that okay? Joe, he asked what's the effectiveness or dangers of different anti-Semitic forces in the U.S. and Europe from the left-wing sector, Islamists, and right-wing or neo-Nazis. Well, I mean, we just saw what happened in Pittsburgh from a right-wing neo-Nazi. We certainly know the dangers, and that there's a very interesting article I would suggest people take a look at it from Michael Ledeen, who's a freedom scholar at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He wrote on PJ Media. He's an expert in Italian fascism and has written a lot about Iran, and he examined why this, in many ways, we should not have been ambushed by this attack because Jews have been under attack in this country for a long time. In terms of the statistics from the FBI, and discrimination was still not too far back, right? In terms of elite universities having quotas and all of that. That, America's viewed, I know, as a paradise for by American Jews, but it wasn't always a paradise, and he points this out. And it's a very, I think, important article on PJ Media from Michael Ledeen. In Europe, clearly the danger, it's different. The dangers are Jews have been killed by only by Islamists, right, over the last number of years. The main threat to European Jewry right now are Islamists, European Muslims, returning Islamic State fighters who come back who have been trained, Hezbollah supporters. In Germany, for example, the German government refuses to outlaw all of Hezbollah. There are 950 members operating in Germany, raising money and recruiting new members. Germany just refuses to outlaw them. The Americans and Canada and other countries, as I mentioned, have outlawed all of Hezbollah, but you have these mosques that are dominated in community centers by Shiite terrorists, one could argue, at least are involved in terror financing, and there's no political will on the part of the Europeans. I think what's happening in Germany right now, and one could argue Germany in general, but Germany in particular, and Europe in general, this toxic mix of migrants and some refugees and immigrants who are steeped in Jew hatred, who have been socialized in that climate, combined with the rise of some very far-right parties and sort of general political incompetence is a societal and political recipe for implosion. So that's very troubling. The left-wing anti-Semitism is also very disturbing. There's a politician in Germany from the left party. It's a very large opposition party in the Bundestag, Christina Buchholz, who supports Hamas and Hezbollah, but she's not, hasn't been ousted in any way, and she's openly defends their resistance against Israel. That's a very dangerous party on many levels because they've sent members aboard the Gaza flotilla. And then, of course, in the Alternative for Germany party, a far-right party, you've got right-wing extremists who have, played down the Holocaust, or Alexander Gauland, one of the main party members, has praised the Wehrmacht, Germany's army during World War I and World War II. So you've got a very unsavory and nasty climate. But again, from my departure point, my analysis, I see radical Islam as the main danger for Jews and Israeli institutions in Europe right now. In terms of, and we have the evidence to support it, in terms of the United States, it's a different cat here because there's less indifference, societal indifference toward Jews, and Jews, at least according to this recent Pew study I read, it as an ethnic religious group, is very beloved by Americans. I remember seeing a report. So there's more of and politicians are much more willing to confront anti-Semitism here in their speeches. You don't see, and this gets to your question, in Europe, you don't see the type of countervailing forces you see in the United States against anti-Semitism. I think these types of figures in Pittsburgh, Robert, what was it? Pardon? Bowers, thank you. I wasn't trying to pronounce it. That's going to be a real danger, and because you're going to have these sort of, right-wing fascists who are animated by lethal anti-Semitism, who are not part of a larger movement. Whereas in Europe, you have real Islamic movements or mini movements. So to deal with that in the United States, you're going to need enhanced security. In terms of the Israel-related anti-Semitism, you may have problems with increased BDS activity in your Congress right now, right, because of the election of two congresswomen from Minnesota and Michigan, who both support BDS. So that's very unsettling from the point of view that you've seen a bleep now on the bubble on the sort of on the BDS cardiac monitor in Congress, where you could actually see someone or two representatives propose pro-BDS legislation. I'm not sure if it would come to that. Well, sure. Her question was about the demographics in Europe, or a statement that there will be an increase in Muslims that will overtake non-Muslim births. I mean, it's these are questions for the Europeans to have to deal with. I recall an anecdote from the peerless Middle East scholar Bernard Lewis, who passed away this year at 101, or he was going to be 101, who was asked in an interview after 9/11 by a European reporter, I believe he was a German reporter, when Lewis talked about the spread of or the growth of European Muslim the growth of the European Muslim population in Europe, the reporter asked him, well, what can we do about the demographic changes? And Lewis said to him on the phone, have more babies. But the reporter never called back, and I don't believe quoted him in the article. So we can end on that note, but thanks for carving out the time to come.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.